if I walk down to the corner store this afternoon, right, and I buy a simple jar of strawberry jam,
Yeah.
I am fundamentally altering the atomic and social structure of Western civilization.
Which is a pretty wild thing to say out loud.
It really is.
Yeah.
But that's the incredibly ambitious mind.
Yeah.
That's the incredibly ambitious, mind-bending argument we are unpacking today. So, welcome to you, the learner, to another deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Usually, when we think about our daily routines, there's this underlying expectation of isolation. We view our lives like this series of disconnected dots.
Right. We go to the store.
Exactly. You go to work, it all feels very contained. We like to think that buying groceries is just buying groceries.
And that assumption of isolation is exactly what the author of our source text wants to just completely tear down.
Yeah.
The moment you step into the realm of socio-religious philosophy, specifically the theories of societal structure we are examining today, that isolated vacuum shatters. We are forced to look at a landscape of human interaction that is entirely, inextricably interconnected.
It's basically the definition of the butterfly effect, but applied to human morality and the rise and fall of civilization.
Precisely.
So our mission today is to analyze Chapter 1 of a document by Stacey. It's titled The Genesis Framework, How the West Was Built and How It Can Be Renewed.
And the author is attempting a massive synthesis here. He's taking ancient biblical theology, specifically the mandate found in Genesis 1.28, and attempting to to create what is essentially a grand unified theory of human flourishing.
It's a fascinating text because it doesn't just, stay in the clouds of theology. The author brings in physics, economics, and empirical sociology to build this very specific lens through which he views the mechanics of society.
He really does.
And the architect blueprint that starts at the most microscopic level imaginable.
Intricate is the perfect word for it.
The author presents this idea that absolutely every single interaction in your life generates a tangible, measurable social energy.
Right.
And this energy actively does one of two things. It either builds up society or it destroys it. Does one of two things. It either builds up society or it destroys it. There is literally no neutral ground.
None at all in this framework.
So before he even touches the biblical text, he establishes what we might call the physics and philosophy of give and take.
Yeah, he argues that the observable universe is fundamentally constructed upon this reciprocal principle. The foundational rule of his entire thesis is that absolutely nothing exists or even can exist in total isolation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because starting a socio-theological framework with atomic physics is quite the pivot.
It is a bit of a jump, yeah.
How exactly does he establish this universal principle?
Well, he starts with the atom as his only exists through the dynamic relationship, the continuous push and pull between electrons and protons.
Right.
If you isolate an electron, you don't have an atom. You just have a stray particle. Molecules only emerge when at least two types of atoms interact. He establishes that existence itself is completely reliant on dynamic relationships.
Microscopic to the macroscopic. He points to ecosystems.
Yeah.
A forest doesn't exist as a single monolithic entity. It only survives through the complex reciprocal interaction of a multitude of different entities.
The predator and the prey.
Right. The flora and the fauna, the fungi and the soil. If one element is isolated or removed, the whole and the fauna, the fungi and the soil. If one element is isolated or removed, the whole ecosystem collapses.
He even applies this to commercial enterprises, which sets the stage for his later arguments on economics.
How so?
He says a business cannot exist in a vacuum. A company is only sustained through the continuous reciprocal relationship. Like if the business offers a product but no one buys it, or a customer has money but the business has no product, the enterprise ceases to exist.
It's a universal law of interdependence. And what surprised me is that he doesn't just use Western science to prove this. He brings in Eastern philosophy as well.
Oh, right. The yin-yang.
Yeah. He references the
yin-yang.
Yeah. He references the ancient Taoist yin-yang symbol.
Which is actually a brilliant visual representation of his core argument. The Taoists understood that reality is formed by diverse, often seemingly opposing entities converging to form a new, integrated whole.
The light and
To form a new, integrated whole.
the light and the dark, the masculine and the feminine.
Push and the pull, exactly.
And importantly, that symbol shows a dot of light within the dark and a dot of dark within the light. It illustrates that within each entity lies the necessary element that allows it to connect with its complement.
They aren't just
connect with its complement.
crashing into each other randomly.
Right, they're designed to fit together.
Which bridges us directly to his reading of the biblical creation story.
Yeah, tell me about that.
The author points out that in the Genesis narrative, order in life only emerged from the intentional distinction and subsequent interaction of separate elements.
God doesn't just conjure a blended
From the darkness. He separates the land from the sea.
It's a very structural way to read the creation account, not just as a sequence of divine magic tricks, but as the establishment of a universal mechanical law.
God is basically setting up the board so that these distinct entities can interact.
Okay, so that is the crux of his physical philosophy must be generated.
Right.
And that energy is exclusively the product of the interplay between distinct entities in a relationship.
Humans, he argues, are bound by this exact same cosmic paradigm. We are created to relate with each other and with the physical world.
And through this perpetual process of give and take, we generate the literal energy required to build families, friendships, homes, and economies.
But he gets very granular about what this interaction actually produces. It's not just a vague philosophical concept of, like, good vibes.
Right.
He argues that every give and take action generates 3 specific measurable forces. And this brings us back to that jar of jam analogy, which I think perfectly grounds what could otherwise be a very abstract theory.
The jam analogy is essential. Let's walk through it.
Okay.
You walk into a local shop to buy a jar of strawberry jam. According to the author, this isn't just a simple transfer of currency for calories.
No, 3 distinct forces are immediately...
The first force he identifies is the force of existence. What exactly does that mean in this context?
The force of existence is the factual reality of the transaction itself. The jam was on a shelf, and now it is in your bag.
Okay.
The money was in your wallet, now it is in the shopkeeper's till. A factual, undeniable event not have existed without that specific interaction. You've brought a new reality into existence.
Okay, that makes sense. It's the material outcome. But then he talks about the force of action. Is that the psychological or interpersonal part of the exchange?
Exactly. The force of action is the human element of the give and take. It is the greeting you exchange with the shopkeeper.
The A.
Element of the give and take. It is the greeting you exchange with the shopkeeper.
The A, how you doing?
Right. It's the eye contact, the mutual agreement on the value of the goods, that brief moment of shared humanity. This force of action is what weaves and sustains the immediate social fabric of a local community. It builds micro levels of trust and
Multiplication. And this is where the web really spreads out, where the butterfly effect takes hold.
the force of multiplication is the ripple effect. Because you engaged in that transaction, you are contributing to a massive invisible ecosystem.
Yeah.
Your purchase helps sustain the employment of the delivery driver who brought that specific jar to the store. You are supporting the factory workers who manufactured the glass jar and stamped the metal lid.
Wow.
You are paying a fraction of the wage of the accountant who balances the shop's books and the farmer who grew the strawberries months ago.
It's staggering to think about a mundane errand that way. Every single interaction creates existence, action, and multiplication.
The author states explicitly that a central feature of understanding reality is recognizing that absolutely everything we do has a consequential, multiplying impact on the wider society.
There are no isolated actions in this framework.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the author introduces his concept of moral polarity. Because if every action generates this multiplying energy, the most pressing question becomes, what kind of energy are we generating?
Right. If I'm a node in this massive network, am I pumping clean water into the system, or am I...
When an interaction occurs in accordance with what he terms God's original design, it generates positive energy that leads to broader social improvement.
Okay, and the flip side.
Conversely, when an interaction takes place outside the realm of that intended design, those acts produce negative energy that directly and measurably...
To illustrate this difference in polarity, he compares taking antibiotics to taking cocaine.
It's a brilliant comparison because it isolates the variable. Both actions are fundamentally the same type of interaction.
Let's look at the mechanics of it. On one hand, you have a person taking antibiotics to cure a physical infection. On the other hand, you have a person taking cocaine to numb an inner sense of profound loneliness. Both of these are physical interactions between a human body and a chemical substance.
Exactly. Both are forms of give and take. Both generate existence, action, and multiplication.
But they produce profoundly different teleological outcomes, different end goals for society.
Yeah.
The antibiotic interaction aligns with healing and restoration.
Yeah.
The energy it generates allows that person to recover, to return to their family, to go back to work, and to be a productive member of the community. It multiplies positive social energy and stability.
While the cocaine interaction is motivation of it, and the ripple effects, the multiplication force, are entirely destructive.
How so?
Well, the purchase of the cocaine fuels a violent black market. The consumption degrades the individual's physical and mental health. It fractures their relationships. It ultimately drains medical and emotional resources from the community.
So the give and take interaction happened.
A lot of his framework. Before he even touches the specific biblical blessings, he has laid down this foundational rule.
You are constantly generating energy,
And that energy is either aligned with a divine design for human flourishing or a misaligned design that fuels societal collapse.
which sets the stage perfectly for the main event of the text.
Societal collapse. Right.
Having established that our interactions create this tangible social energy, the author then turns to the biblical text to explain how we are supposed to harness this energy for good. He points to 3 specific channels based on Genesis 1.28.
Yes, Genesis, rock of the entire Genesis framework. It is the verse where God gives humanity 3 distinct directives.
Be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion.
Exactly.
Let's tackle the first channel, the first blessing. Be fruitful. Now, in modern vernacular, if someone says be fruitful, we almost universally assume they mean biological reproduction.
Having kids.
Yeah, having kids. But the author interprets this entirely.
Having kids.
Yeah, having kids. But the author interprets this entirely differently.
He separates be fruitful from multiply. In his socio-religious framework, the first blessing, being fruitful, has absolutely nothing to do with procreation.
Wait, really? Nothing at all?
Nothing. It is entirely about personal internal development. It is the mandate to become an integrated individual whose mind and body are perfectly unified.
Okay, so he calls it cultivating a godly mind and becoming a temple of God.
Mm-hmm.
And he brings in some heavy theological hitters to back up this interpretation.
Mm.
He cites St. Augustine, specifically his seminal work, Confessions.
Augustine is vital here because he was operating in the Roman Empire, right? A time of massive social decay.
Right.
Augustine focused heavily on the internal attributes that enable a human being to truly thrive. He advocated for internal virtues like profound love, deep wisdom, and rigorous self-discipline.
And Augustine saw the pursuit of these internal virtues not just as good habits, but as the literal reflection of divine perfection within the human soul.
The text also pulls from the book of Proverbs, noting the famous verse, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." It points to Jesus' call in the Gospel of Matthew to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Furthermore, he his body like an athlete, keeping it under strict control.
Yeah, the author synthesizes all of this to argue that the first blessing requires a rigorous, exhausting internal pursuit of virtue. The mind must be trained to entertain concepts that inspire the body to offer acts of goodness to the world.
So what does this all mean in practice? Because I have to imagine that having good thoughts isn't enough.
It's not.
There are plenty of people who sit on mountaintops or in comfortable armchairs meditating on love, peace, and wisdom, but it doesn't necessarily build a functional civilization.
And the author emphatically agrees with that critique. In his framework, intentions, no matter how pure, no matter fairly insufficient on their own.
Oh, interesting.
This is where we get to the core mechanism of the first blessing, the concept of mind-body unity.
Right. He insists that intentions must be substantiated into physical reality.
Think back to the universal rule of give and take. A mind existing in isolation generates nothing. A goal produces zero social energy.
So the mind must interact with the physical world through the vehicle of the body.
When a virtuous mind dictates an action and the body executes that action in physical reality, that specific interaction creates 2 vital forces: rational thought and common sense.
I love the analogies the text uses for this because they bring the theology crashing down into practical reality. The author says, imagine you entertain the thought in your mind that you can put your bare hand into a roaring fire without getting hurt.
Yeah.
Your intention might be pure curiosity. You might genuinely believe you are immune to the heat. But your intention might be pure curiosity. You might genuinely believe you are immune to the heat. But physical reality swiftly and violently teaches you otherwise.
The physical interaction provides immediate, undeniable feedback to the mind. That feedback loop is what generates common sense.
And he scales that concept up to explain how we develop rational thinking. A bridge.
Right.
An engineer wouldn't dare build a massive suspension bridge using a brand new, entirely untested mathematical formula that had never been subjected to real-world physical stress tests.
Because thoughts without grounding in the physical world become unmoored from reality. If you implement irrational, untested thoughts, they don't just fail. If the engineer builds the bridge on pure, unsubstantiated theory, the bridge collapses.
Yeah.
People get hurt. Society suffers.
So the first blessing is this constant, rigorous feedback loop. A virtuous mind dictates an action to the body. The body interacts with physical reality. Physical reality provides feedback, the mind adjusts, and this loop generates rational thought and common sense.
Yes.
But there is a second, deeply sociological output from this first blessing that the author argues is the absolute bedrock of human civilization.
Yes, and this is crucial. When a person achieves this mind-body unity, when their physical actions consistently and reliably match their stated virtuous intentions, it generates the most powerful social force in existence: trust.
Trust. It sounds so simple, but the text treats it like the atomic glue of society.
The author leans heavily on sociological principles here to confirm that trust is the absolute foundation of...
Without stable relationships, you have no communal harmony.
Exactly. If you cannot trust that the engineer tested the math, you won't drive on the bridge. If you cannot trust that the shopkeeper will actually give you the jam when you hand over the money, the local economy instantly collapses. Trust is the currency that allows civilization to function.
And this is where I think it takes the most mundane, repetitive, sometimes exhausting elements of our daily lives and elevates them to a cosmic level.
It profoundly reframes the drudgery of daily existence.
The text explicitly states that preparing a healthy meal for your family, genuinely greeting a neighbor you pass on the street, or patiently addressing a frustrated customer's complaint at work. These are not just chores.
No.
They aren't just the friction of getting through a Tuesday. In the Genesis framework, these are literal acts of bringing God's blessings down to earth.
Let's break down the mechanics of why he says that. Each of those mundane actions requires a virtuous intention in the mind to be substantiated by a physical action of the body.
Right.
You have to choose the virtue of patience when facing the angry customer, and then you have to physically speak the empathetic words, controlling your tone and your posture.
And in doing so, you are generating positive social energy. You are engaged in action and multiplication. You are actively sustaining the community.
The author states that a wholesome, thriving community is built solely because individuals personally take responsibility to live these fruitful, mind-body unified lives.
It places the burden of societal health squarely on the shoulders of the individual. You cannot engineer a utopia from the top down if the citizens at the bottom have not achieved the first blessing of personal maturity and trust.
But the text makes it clear that mastering your own mind-body unity hits a ceiling.
How so?
You can only generate so much social energy as an isolated individual. To scale this up, to generate the massive amounts of energy required to sustain a civilization across generations, the author turns to the second blessing.
Okay. The mandate to multiply. This scales the framework from the perfected individual to the ultimate interpersonal role.
And once again, the author grounds this in a very specific traditional theological reading of Genesis. He focuses on Genesis 1.27. So God created man in his image, male and female, he created them.
His interpretation of this is incredibly layered. He doesn't just read this as a historical account of God making two genders.
Yeah. He ties it back to his universal universe is designed in complementary pairs to generate energy protons and electrons, light and dark, land and sea. Then God himself must be understood as a harmonized being who perfectly embodies both masculine and feminine characteristics.
That is a massive theological pillar for his argument. Because if God embodies masculine and feminine essences, then a single wholesome individual, no matter how fully they have achieved the first blessing, no matter how virtuous they are, can never be the complete manifestation of God on earth.
They're only one half of the equation.
Exactly. The text argues that the most accurate, potent reflection of the divine reality on earth is a male and a female who have bonded together in a lifelong marriage.
He references the New Testament to support this profound elevation of the marital bond. He points to Ephesians 5, where the Apostle Paul describes the union of husband and wife as a sacred mystery that reflects the ultimate relationship between Christ.
Christ quotes Genesis, saying, "A man will leave his parents and unite with his wife, and the two become one flesh."
What God has joined together, let no one separate. The text posits that a harmonious, mind-body, unified man and woman coming together in marriage is the most complete substantiation of God's image possible in physical reality.
Wow.
But the framework substantiation of God's image possible in physical reality.
Wow.
But the framework doesn't stop at the couple. The ultimate generative energy of this reciprocal relationship, the literal manifestation of the multiply mandate, is the birth of children.
What's fascinating here is how the author frames procreation. It is not discussed merely as procreation. It is not discussed merely as biological continuation or evolutionary drive.
No, not at all.
It is framed as a literal physical echo of God's internal creative give and take. The reciprocal, trusting love of the husband and wife generates immense spiritual and emotional energy, and that energy physically manifests as new human life.
And from a sociological standpoint, the birth of a child within this framework is viewed as the ultimate engine of positive social forces. The text maps out the multiplication effect of a child's birth in incredible detail.
Let's walk through that, because it's not just about adding a number to the population.
First, when a married couple that has achieved the first blessing, it forces massive, immediate psychological growth upon the parents.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They must instantly transition from living for themselves to becoming entirely selfless caretakers. It demands a higher level of virtue and sacrifice.
Furthermore, it builds vast, complex outward networks. The birth of a child permanently links two extended families together, grandparents, aunts, uncles.
Yeah.
As the child grows, it connects the parents to local schools, to pediatricians, to neighborhood sports leagues, to churches, and to local economies.
The parents are set in their geographic area. All of this energy, this massive network of give and take, is directed toward the public good for the sake of the next generation's well-being.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as much as this is a heavily theological and philosophical argument, the author doesn't just rely on scripture to make his point.
No, he doesn't.
His religious claims about the marital family translate directly into measurable human flourishing.
He attempts to prove that the theological design is actually a measurable sociological reality. He cites Linda Waite's extensive sociological research, specifically her landmark book, The Case for Marriage.
Let's dig into that data. What exactly does Waite's research show, according to the text?
The text asserts that Waite's research, which analyzed vast amounts of demographic data, demonstrates that married couples, on average, experience significantly superior outcomes across almost every metric of well-being.
Like what?
They show higher levels of physical health, lower rates of mortality, greater economic stability, more accumulated wealth, and higher levels of self-reported happiness compared to individuals in cohabiting arrangements or single-parent households.
Now, wait, hold on. Let me push back on this data on behalf of the listener. It's the classic correlation versus causation problem. Are we sure that the institution of marriage is health? Or is it simply that people who are already healthy, well-educated, and financially stable are more likely to get married in the first place?
That is the exact critique that many modern sociologists bring up when looking at marriage data.
Right.
However, within the context of the author's Genesis framework, he argues that the structure of marriage itself acts as the engine. Because marriage requires the ultimate give and take, the ultimate merging of distinct entities, it forces the individuals to generate the energy, the trust, the sacrifice, the pooled resources that leads to those superior outcomes. The framework argues it is causative.
So the argument is that the structure of marriage generates a protective and prosperous energy for the adults. But what about the children?
For that, the text cites another major sociological study, Sarah McClanahan and Gary Sandifer's Growing Up with a Single Parent.
And how does...
He uses their data to argue that children raised by their married biological parents consistently exhibit higher rates of educational attainment, lower rates of behavioral issues, and greater emotional resilience.
Okay.
The author frames the sociological advantage not just as a product of having two incomes or more supervision, but as a spiritual reality, because they are being raised within the optimal, intended Genesis framework.
And he makes a stark macro-level point here about the absolute necessity of this structure. He states that the only way a community, a nation, or a civilization can continue to exist, sustain its cultural goodness, and have any hope for future development is through the birth and nurturing of children.
Yes.
Without that, the community quite literally goes extinct. It's a biological and sociological absolute.
Which brings up a very important nuance in the text regarding individuals who are not married.
Yes, I was just thinking about that. Because there are millions of people who are single, whether by choice, by difficult cir- are millions of people who are single, whether by choice, by difficult circumstance, or by tragedy like the death of a spouse. Does the author think single people are failing this grand framework? That they are somehow defective nodes in the social energy grid?
The text anticipates that question and addresses it directly. It clarifies it as failures. In fact, it states they play a vital, indispensable role in enriching society.
Right.
They support extended family networks, they contribute to the economy, they innovate, and they engage in countless acts of community service.
So a single person can still perfectly fulfill the first blessing. They can achieve profound mind-body unity, positive social energy.
Precisely. However, the author maintains a rigid stance on the macro-level structure. He argues that while individuals can thrive as singles, the marital family structure must succeed on a societal level as the dominant cultural norm.
Because of the extinction factor we just talked about.
Yes. It is in the vested interest of single people and everyone else in a civilization that the marital family remains the cultural ideal. Because without the continuous generation of new life and the networks of support that families build, the society that sustains everyone, including the single individuals, simply ages out, fractures, and disappears.
Okay, so we have the first blessing, perfecting the individual through mind-body unity to generate trust. We have the second blessing, uniting male and female in marriage to reflect the divine and generate the future through children. This brings us to the final expansion of the framework.
The third blessing. Have dominion. This mandate transitions the framework from the internal world out into the physical world and the macroeconomy.
Now, have dominion is a phrase that carries a lot of baggage. Historically, it's often been interpreted as a license to conquer, exploit, and extract from the earth.
Yeah.
But the author frames it entirely differently. He views economic activity and the manipulation of the physical world not as a secular necessity, but as a divine blessing of structural caveat.
A critical caveat that ties the whole framework together. The text argues that economic activity is only considered a true blessing if it rests firmly and completely upon the moral foundation of the first blessing.
Meaning personal integrity, mind-body unity, trust.
Exactly. To illustrate this, the text references the parable of the talents from Matthew. To illustrate this, the text references the parable of the talents from Matthew 25. In this parable, a master gives his servants different amounts of money talents and expects them to invest and multiply it while he is away.
Right.
The servants who take the risk, work hard, and double the money are praised and rewarded. The servant who hides the money out of fear is praised and rewarded. The servant who hides the money out of fear is condemned.
The core message of that parable, applied to this framework, is that individuals are spiritually and socially rewarded for developing their skills, taking initiative, and utilizing resources to offer products and services that actively enhance their community. Generating wealth through hard work is seen as a virtuous act.
This raises an important question, though. What happens when business is disconnected from that first blessing, moral integrity? We've all seen corporate greed. We know how ruthless and destructive the free market can be when left unchecked.
The author addresses this, and he issues a severe warning. Of personal wholesomeness, the business world inevitably becomes thoroughly corrupt.
Yeah.
And a corrupt business sector doesn't just fail to generate positive energy, it actively, aggressively generates forces of social decline.
It goes right back to the cocaine versus antibiotics analogy we discussed at the beginning. If a business enterprise is built on exploiting human addiction, utilizing deceptive marketing, or causing reckless environmental destruction, it is generating massive amounts of negative social energy.
It's multiplying decay.
It is multiplying decay, regardless of how much financial profit it records on a balance sheet.
Someone operating with that first blessing integrity manipulates the physical world to benefit their community. The author frames this as a holy, sacred act. They are literally channeling God's creative nature.
And I think it's important to connect this back to you, the listener, because when we hear phrases like macroeconomy or to be the CEO of a multinational tech conglomerate or a billionaire real estate tycoon to participate in this blessing.
Right, it sounds very high level.
But the text frames it much more intimately.
It honors the dignity of everyday labor.
Yes. Whether you are working a physical trade like plumbing or carpentry to feed your family, whether you are an engineer managing the heating and cooling systems for a residential building, or whether you are a customer service representative calmly helping a confused client over the phone, if you conduct that work with integrity, honesty, and a genuine desire to solve the other person, you are acting as a caretaker.
A steward.
A steward of both the natural environment and the social fabric. You are taking the raw materials of the world, whether that's copper pipes, data streams, or human interaction, and ordering them in a way that generates existence, action, and multiplication of a positive polarity.
And the author argues that engaging in this kind of honorable creative stewardship ultimately leads to a very specific economic outcome: the generation of surplus resources. When a community is full of people working with integrity, they produce more than they strictly need to survive.
And it is this surplus that is the ultimate goal of the third blessing, because that surplus, it allows for the building of hospitals, the funding of schools, the creation of social safety nets, and genuine philanthropy. You cannot be generous if you haven't first generated wealth.
So, we have thoroughly mapped out the three pillars of the Genesis framework: the perfected individual, the married family, the ethical economy. Now we arrive at the culmination of the author's argument.
Yeah, this is where it all comes together.
This is where he synthesizes all of these theological and sociological concepts to make his grand historical argument about the rise and the potential catastrophic fall of Western civilization.
He attempts to prove that this framework isn't just an interesting theory or a theological ideal, but the actual historical mechanism that built the prosperity of the modern West.
He starts by pointing to very modern economic data to validate the sequence of these three blessings. He cites the Opportunity Insights team, led by economist Raj Chetty,
Relied upon by sociologists across the political spectrum because of its massive scale and rigorous methodology.
Right.
The author points out that this data shows a very specific developmental progression that leads to economic mobility, what is often referred to in sociological circles as the success sequence.
Let's break down that sequence because it maps perfectly onto the framework we've been discussing. To avoid poverty, an individual should: first, complete their education; second, secure full-time employment; third, get married; and fourth, then have children.
The data indicates that young adults who adhere to this specific progression in this exact order dramatically reduce their chances of falling into poverty by age 30, particularly in Western contexts. The poverty rate for those who follow the sequence is remarkably low, often cited as being in the single digits.
And the author argues that this sociological success sequence perfectly aligns with and effectively proves the divine sequence.
Education and developing personal discipline maps directly to the first blessing, cultivating the mind-body unity and preparing oneself for adulthood.
Securing employment is the early application of the third blessing, taking dominion, becoming self-sufficient, and contributing to the economic give and take of the community.
And then only once that foundation of personal maturity and economic stability is established, do you engage the second blessing, entering into the marital family structure, and subsequently bringing children into a stable environment.
The author claims that societies that culturally promote, incentivize, and celebrate this specific trajectory witness amplified blessings, profound social stability, and generational wealth creation.
He then takes this sociological premise and maps it onto a broad historical timeline. He argues that from the 16th century onward, a massive cultural shift occurred in the West.
When the printing press was invented.
Exactly. As Christian communities were finally able to read the Bible directly for themselves, the principles of the Genesis framework became widely disseminated.
They shifted from being ecclesiastical doctrines to becoming the widespread cultural ideal of the common people.
He gives specific historical examples of this shift. He points to the rise of
Worth wasn't just tied to his aristocratic bloodline or his prowess in battle, but to his personal honor, his keeping of his word, his emotional restraint. which is essentially the first blessing of mind-body unity and trust becoming a cultural standard.
Exactly. And he argues that this cultural adoption of the first blessing directly fueled educational development that followed in the West, because science and commerce require high-trust societies to function.
He specifically highlights the 18th century and zeroes in on figures like John Wesley, the famous Anglican cleric and founder of the Methodist movement.
Wesley is a perfect case study for the author's thesis, because Wesley didn't just preach. Wesley is a perfect case study for the author's thesis, because Wesley didn't just preach abstract theology, he actively organized the working classes of England.
How exactly did Wesley's teachings practically alter society? Because the text claims he spurred massive societal renewal.
Wesley organized his followers into societies that demanded rigorous personal discipline, championed literacy, sobriety, and personal holiness, which perfectly aligns with the first blessing.
Yeah.
He demanded that men stop drinking away their wages and instead return home to care for their wives and children, which stabilizes the second blessing. And he preached a relentless work ethic and frugality. Earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can, which is the exact manifestation.
Religious revivals, they were the practical application of the Genesis framework. And by adopting this framework, the working classes of England transformed themselves, spurred massive economic growth, and ultimately helped build the modern, prosperous Western world. He essentially credits this three-pillared framework as the foundational DNA of Judeo-Christian thought that built civilization as we know it.
But as the full title of his text suggests, How the West Was Built and How It Can Be Renewed, he uses this historical analysis to issue a profound, urgent warning for the contemporary era.
This is his diagnosis of our current cultural moment. He argues that in modern nations with a historically Christian heritage, this vital, life-sustaining cultural ideal is rapidly waning. The engines are being shut down.
He lists the specific symptoms of this decline, and he traces them backward through the framework. He claims that the fundamental knowledge of how to develop individual wholesomeness, how to achieve that by modern culture.
We are abandoning the first blessing. And the domino effect of that abandonment is devastating. Because individuals are no longer cultivating the virtue necessary to sustain lifelong commitments, the marital family norm, the second blessing, is breaking down.
Yeah, the text points to rising divorce rates, declining marriage rate as the inevitable result of losing the first blessing.
And on the economic front, the third blessing, he points to the growing acceptance of deeply unethical, exploitative industries into the mainstream social fabric. He specifically calls out the pornography industry as a prime example.
It's the ultimate example of business divorce from the first blessing of moral integrity. It is an industry that utilizes the universal mechanism of give and take. It generates existence, action, and massive economic multiplication.
Right.
But the polarity is entirely negative. It commodifies the human body, fractures marriages, and generates massive social decay, all while pursuing immense financial profit.
The author believes that this failure to adhere to the Genesis framework is the singular driving force behind modern poverty, epidemic loneliness, social fragmentation, and cultural decline. His ultimate call to action is a plea for a voluntary societal vision of this framework.
Which is a huge call to action.
It is. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, and as we synthesize this deep dive, I want to clearly summarize the author's grand unified theory.
Let's do it.
The Genesis framework posits that the universe runs on a physical and spiritual law of reciprocal give and take, our daily interactable multiplying social energy.
And the author argues there are three divinely intended channels required to harness this energy for human flourishing. The first blessing of rigorous personal integrity and mind-body unity, which generates trust.
The second blessing of the biological marital family, which reflects the divine and generates the future.
And the third blessing of ethical economic stewardship. Which generates the surplus needed to care for the vulnerable.
The thesis is absolute. These three pillars are the literal engines of civilization. Maintain the engines, and society thrives. Break the engines, and the society stalls, fractures, and eventually collapses.
That's the core message.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the sources, we always like to leave you, the learner, with a final, provocative thought to mull over, something to explore on your own that builds on what we've discussed today.
If the author is right about his foundational universal rule that absolutely every single interaction creates the forces of existence, action, and multiplication, consider our modern digital landscape.
Oh, that is a fascinating application.
Think about the thousands of micro-interactions we engage in every single day that didn't even exist a generation ago. When we argue with a faceless, anonymous stranger in a comment section online, when we passively consume hours of in a comment section online, when we passively consume hours of algorithmic, short-form video content designed purely to hold our attention.
Yeah.
Based on the strict rules of the Genesis framework, what kind of give-and-take energy are we actually generating in those moments?
Are we acting as stewards of the social fabric? Are we creating trust, building rational thought, and generating positive social capital?
Or by interacting in ways that are disembodied, anonymous, and so often driven by outrage, envy, or distraction rather than virtue, are we actively multiplying the very social decay the author warns about? If every single click, economy of give and take, what exactly are we purchasing for our culture?
That is a phenomenal, deeply challenging question to chew on. It takes an ancient theological framework and makes it hyper-relevant to how we look at our phones tonight. The Learner, thank you as always for joining the conversation today.
Thanks for listening.
Remember, true learning means having the courage to explore a diverse world, even or perhaps especially when those blueprints challenge our own assumptions about how the world works. We formally conclude this deep dive into the sources.